So thank you again to everyone for joining us. We're excited to present today on our colleague optimization webinar. And as we continue our webinar series, we want to make sure we're providing topical information to our client partners. Just before we begin, some housekeeping reminders. You should have come in on mute, so we do ask you stay on mute to avoid any background noise. We will have time for questions at the end where you can come off of mute, or during the presentation if you want to type your questions into chat. Again, we will address them at the end. We are going to send a link to the recording after this webinar today, so you will have that for reference. With that, I'm going to turn it over to today's presenters, Kelly Sinicola and Mark Tuck.
Jessica. Welcome everybody. For those of you that don't know me, my name is Kelly Sinicola. I'm the Executive Vice President for Professional Services here at Frelly. Joining me is my esteemed colleague, Mark Tuck, Director of Professional Services here at Frelly. We're going to start off today with a poll. And the question being, when was the last time your ERP was assessed? 1 to 3 months? 1 to 2 years, 3 to 5 years, or assessed? Question mark. Why should we look at things? And we'll give everybody just a couple seconds to respond to that poll. I will say that my favorite answer has an early lead. Okay. So the assessed question mark answer is clearly the winner here, with most people saying that that's the last time their ERP was assessed, with the second place runner-up being 3 to 5 years. Which probably is a good reason for those of you attending the webinar today. So our first topic is, what does optimization mean? The goal of optimization in this context, we want to, first of all, improve infrastructure. Generally, in this case that we're talking about, it involves moving to SQL, making sure that you're moving to something more stable, something more easily supported throughout the higher education community. We also have a goal towards reducing manual labor, so leaning more into the features and functionality that your colleague ERP is meant to provide to you. We also want to maximize that license technology. Again, when you're using more features and functions of that ERP that you're paying for, you're getting a better return on investment. So we want to make sure you're getting your most amount of dollars out of that ESSA investment. We also want to make sure we're aligning process with tools. In the very early days of ERP technology, our goal was to really make that ERP jump through those hoops to make sure it was doing everything that we wanted to do with our business processes. Now we're leaning more towards a time where we're aligning those processes with those tools so everything flows in a much easier, more seamless manner. We also want to make sure that those systems are sustainable. That means, in general, decustomizing so that when software updates come through, it's easier to adopt and we're able to take advantage of the new features and functionalities that the ERP provides us. I know before we used to be known as sort of here at Frelly as the team that would help you customize your system. Lately, we've been more on the side of decustomizing everyone's system. So the objective here, we're talking about modernizing your database, moving to SQL, possibly from Unidata or another platform, improving processes where they're overly complicated or manual, improving areas where there's too much customization, or, let's just go with all of the above and making sure that we're taking all of these steps to improve the technology that we have on our campus. In a SQL migration, we are moving from Unidata to SQL, and this provides us with other benefits besides just moving that database technology. In many cases, SQL has data structures that you have to stay within, where Unidata was more free-flowing with what it was able to accept. So we're getting better data standards when we're doing that database migration. We're also trying to use the SQL migration as a tool to reduce our custom footprint. So really using this as an opportunity to do some change management and see where we can decustomize. We also want to reduce manual labor. We meet with clients every day where they're saying, well, we do this manual process. It takes 74 steps for a student to register. It takes 53 steps for us to get a requisition through procurement. We want to make sure we're reducing those steps and using any systems and tools we have in the ERP system. Because we now have new data standards in that new database structure, we can also improve reporting. So we've all heard garbage in, garbage out. We want to take the steps to improve reporting so that we're getting the, answering the right questions. You also are able to use more of the tools that you have. So we encourage our clients to lean into a lot of the tools that you already have licensing for on campus already. In some cases, that's Power BI, leaning into a reporting tool that you might be already paying for in your Microsoft Campus agreement and using it against your ERP database as well. And so our process is to first assess. We want to get an understanding of where you are, what your current state is. Then we develop a plan and we execute that plan to optimize your ERP. Seems pretty straightforward, 3-bubble process. How easy can it be, right? But we'll go into a little more in depth about what each of those steps mean. In our assessment focus areas, we focus on meeting with each department on campus. We talk about human resources and the processing that happens in that department. We meet with the catalog and curriculum management folks and talk to them about how they're currently utilizing the ERP to enter in the catalog, to define curricula. We talk about migrating to self-service. That's a very hot topic lately with the cessation of WebAdvisor coming right around the corner. We talk about processes like billing and payment management. How are students able to see their account receivable records? How are they able to make payments? How are those reconciled? We also talk about operational assessments, walking through specific processes that every campus has to do and making sure that we're optimizing those and making them the most efficient that they can be. We also talk about reporting strategy and deployment. We've worked with campuses with simply zero reporting strategy to campuses with very robust reporting strategies. And we want to make sure that everyone has access to the data they need to make the best decisions. And then we talk about areas where we can optimize the ERP, functions, features, business processes that aren't set up, aren't being used. We're able to really take a look at that low-hanging fruit and offer up suggestions on how we can make those processes better. So the components of our assessment process are first requirements gathering. We ask for a pretty extensive list of documentation. It's scary. It's a very long list of documentation, but most campuses don't have all of the pieces and parts that we're asking for, and that's okay. If you were doing your own assessment on campus, we'd also encourage you to look at documents like that. We employ an interview-based approach. We sit down with each department, whether those interviews are one-on-one or stakeholder groups, and talk with folks. Lately, it's been on Zoom the past year, but we long for a day when we can go back on campus and have these meetings and talk about what you're doing now, what are your pain points, what do you wish could be done? If you had a magic wand, what would you make better? After those interviews, and sometimes during those interviews, we log into the system and take a look and validate what we were hearing. Look at configuration, look at logs, look to see what processes are and are not being used. And then we offer recommendations in a report. So we go through, we write up what we heard, what the pain points were, what people's wishes and dreams and hopes were for the future of the ERP. And then we write up our recommendations, and you can choose to do these recommendations on your own or work with a firm like us to improve those and add those into your system. We then do a presentation of our findings to the stakeholder groups, to the executive teams, whoever you want us to present to, so that everyone can hear loud and clear what we heard when we were on campus. During that pre-engagement review, we look at, as I said, it was a long list. We look at budget material for the last year, for any future years that are budgeted out. We look at the institutional strategic plan. We want to make sure that we're aligning the technology to meet your strategic needs. We look at the number of faculty and staff that you currently have and any hires that are maybe in the funnel. We look at your organizational charts. We look at an institutional directory with departments and titles so we can get a better understanding of how your campus is composed. We look at any current audit findings, and we look at desk manuals. Don't let this one scare you. Not many campuses have desk manuals, but that's something that we like to leave after an optimization. We also look at any active policies and procedures. We want to look at your new account setup. We want to look at how accounts are deleted. We want to look at any policies and procedures that affect the way you use technology on campus. So our goal here is to ask the right questions to get the right results. That's one of our tenets here. We know that there's lots of ways to come to the wrong answer, especially with bad data. So we want to make sure that we're getting you to the right spot. As we mentioned, that assessment process then includes those interviews, meeting with the teams. We also look at policy and process objectives. So since during that pre-engagement review, we had gone through all of your policy and procedure documents, we ask, well, why are things this way? Why is this your policy? Is there a reason? Is it cultural? Then we try to come to an understanding on your business processes. So we will sit with the accounts receivable group, for example, and ask, how do you bill? How do you generate statements? And we talk about those in a process context. The first question that we get mostly when we start to schedule these interviews is, what do I need to bring? What do I need to know? What do I need to study up for? And the answer is always, you do your job every single day. We want you to come with that context. During those business process reviews, we generally come across customizations. And so as we're talking about billing, for example, maybe someone stumbles across oh, well, that's X ABC. Well, we know that's a customization, and we start to dig into why that customization exists, what it's used for, how long it's been there. And then if we run into roadblocks like it's just the way we've always done it, which is something we hear quite often, that's when we're able to dig into the system review and take a look at what that customization does. Which brings us to the analysis phase, where we're logging into the system, looking at the logs, taking a look at those customizations, really digging into the code. We look at the business processes, we compare those to the best practices that we know across the industry. We also identify key findings by each area and overall. So that document's going to be broken up into, human resources. We talk to them, this is what we heard, and this is what we recommend for that area. And we include that for every department that we meet with. We cover any systemic and cross-functional issues. That becomes really readily apparent during this interview process, especially if we're meeting. Recently, we met with a registrar's office, and they were talking about an issue. It also affected accounts receivable. It also affected financial aid. So as each group brings up these issues, we're able to really identify where all these paths are coming from. We also, like I mentioned, dig down deep into that code to make sure we know what each of those customizations are doing. Also finding out if there's any bad data hiding under the covers of the system. So with that garbage in, garbage out concept, making sure we're looking at that data. And we develop our recommendations report. The results, we look at focusing on any opportunities to realign process with the tool, any custom code that could be eliminated, data transformations that may be necessary. Recently, we met with a school and they had a lot of custom tables. And so we had to create a path for them to move that information from custom tables to delivered tables within Colleague that can support that data now. And we made out a map for them on how to make that happen. Any technical improvements that are possible. So we're looking at things like database tuning, listeners, all of those arguments that are on each listener. We also look for any way that we can reduce or eliminate pain points. Everybody was generous enough with their time to meet with us during that interview process. So we want to make sure that they're walking away with some of their pain points eliminated. In those interviews too, a lot of low-hanging fruit often comes up. So recently we were in one where registrar's office didn't know about the deregistration process. So we were able to go through a quick training during their interview just to add a bit more time in each day during registration period. And then we also do that recommendations roadmap. Then it comes to assessment delivery. We deliver a draft of the detailed report. As I mentioned, it's going to be broken out by each functional area with recommendations for each one. We send it out as a draft first so we can receive any revisions and updates from any of the sponsors of the assessment. We want to make sure that we heard everybody correctly. Then we do a presentation to the stakeholders and leadership presentations. So we're going to go to our second poll of the day. How much of your ERP do you think you use? 25%, 50%, 75%, or do you really think that you're at full utilization? It's a tricky question because we all get those software updates and not quite sure how many of those are, implemented or implemented fully, especially when they involve new mnemonics. We'll give everybody a few more seconds on that poll. Oh, we have a tie. So half of the team here said 50% and half said 75%. Okay, so I'm going to turn it over to Mark Tuck.
Good morning. So you've spent a bunch of time with us. We've built you an entire assessment. So now what? What comes next? You go to the next slide. What we like to do is talk about an optimization approach. And this graphic essentially describes our methodology for moving from the here and now to that optimal place. We're going to talk about each of these in more detail, but essentially, if you engaged in this kind of process with us, what we would do is start off, kind of with that foundation, build out a project plan, get more in depth into some additional assessment. The foundation of all of that optimization really has to do with, one, infrastructure, getting you to the right platform, but also business process. Business process is really what we consider to be the driver of the optimization. It's how you can go from a customized environment to a best practices environment that uses less customization. It provides an opportunity for training for people who may not have had training before or haven't had the opportunity to sit through and really understand why it is their part of the puzzle really matters in the overall. We use all of that information and that new technical platform to then begin actual technical work, which may involve data transformation, development, the build out of a new reporting strategy, potentially. All of those are kind of dependencies towards the actual migration to a SQL environment, and towards newer and more optimized processes that'll work in that environment. All of that going as it should, you would go live in that new optimized environment from both a technical and a functional perspective. Can we go to the next? So, planning the project. Obviously, the key to any successful project is having a plan. And as you can see here in the steps, we follow a fairly standard PMP type process. We identify what the scope of the work is. Having the assessment in hand is really important to this. One, it gives us a good sense of where the issues lie, what kind of infrastructure you already have, what's the current state, both from a technical perspective and infrastructure perspective, but also from staff bandwidth perspective, the kinds of functional issues we want to try and resolve, and what kind of gaps need to be filled in. From there, we'll organize the project. We very much like to have an executive steering committee for these projects. Executive leadership in these kind of endeavors is really important. It's hard to move the key infrastructure, the key data system of an institution without leadership on board. And So typically each month through the course of one of these projects, we would meet with that group. Additionally, there's a project team that is comprised of both our team and the functional management team of the institution. And that's just to ensure that things are staying on track, that communication's happening, that everybody knows what's next. We'll develop a project plan, detailed tasks. That's continually being revised as we go through the project. But essentially that gives us a sense of where are the milestones, what's the schedule going to look like. We'll work with all of those teams and that plan to develop a communications plan, ensuring one, everybody who's directly involved in the project knows what's going on as it goes, but also the wider community learns at the right points in time what's happening. And prior to going live, really understanding, how this might impact them, what they may need to do differently, and setting up all of that kind of information. And then finally, define success. What does it mean to have been optimized in this first, run through of the project? Is it the ability to bill more seamlessly? Is it that financial aid has more automation? Is it that the flow of dollars into the general ledger works better? Is it all of those things? Is it that you can keep up on software updates? Particularly given the self-service release schedule now, staying abreast of current software is really important. So it may involve all of those things, but it's important to know at the beginning where you want to land at the end so that you can see if you actually did it. Next. So like I said, business process reviews are really the key to the kingdom here. What we do is we take that assessment and we really work with you and your teams to identify where we're going to do some real deep dives. So rather than maybe spending a lot of time or a little bit of time on a lot of things, we may be more focused. It may be that doing a complete life cycle walkthrough is really what's necessary. It just depends on your institution and the particular gaps that exist. But one part of that is, one, further identifying what the gaps are, how they can be resolved, and out of that, come up with an improved process. And that may involve technical work. That may involve decustomizing something to go back to baseline. But in any case, we use that to, one, drive towards data transformation, towards procedure documentation, towards technical documentation for any kind of customizations that may need to move or that may need to be upgraded for the SQL environment. And when we run into issues where something isn't going to be compliant in that new environment, addressing them there and understanding the implications of those changes. Next slide, please. So some sample outcomes of those business process reviews. Policy changes. What happens at a lot of institutions is over the course of time, you evolve towards a place where there are a lot of registration barriers. Requisites get out of control. The way registration is actually completed has evolved into a position where it's not using the most current versions of the software to do things as conveniently for students as they could be. So sometimes it's just configuration adjustments. Sometimes it's actually changing, getting the institution to change some policies that will make things go more quickly. We worked with an institution who had an upfront question for every student registering online. And that question was really intended for a very small subset of the students, but every student had to answer it every single time they went into the system. By simply removing that one question, we completely streamlined and changed the way registration worked there, and took the population that needed to answer that question into a more service-oriented approach. They got them what they needed, and what the institution needed without burdening every student during every registration. Data cleanup to improve performance and accuracy. Part of this is just out of necessity in the SQL environment, but sometimes it's to improve reporting in general and to ensure that things make sense the way they should. Integrations of siloed operations. I can't even tell you the number of schools who, when they drop students, refunds don't work, and people come to just live with it. And they deal with it manually, or they have workarounds, and they don't align. The refund amount isn't aligning with what Return to Title IV requires. Part of what we try to do is, one, ensure that what's happening in registration impacts billing correctly, impacts financial aid correctly, and that those things all end up aligning. Typically, custom code reduction is part of every project and part of the success model. And so that, just Kelly mentioned, has now become kind of a built-in to these projects. And of course, less labor to achieve outcomes. I mean, that's good for the individual employees, but it's also good for the operation overall. Technical optimization, just part of moving from Unidata to SQL, necessitates some updates to infrastructure. Typically in these processes, we're standing up a whole entirely new SQL environment and migrating to that new environment, which typically involves new servers and everything on the back end. Code decustomization is a big deal. As I talked about, coming out of the business process reviews, part of that is understanding what the customization was there to do. And then working with those teams to identify if colleague can do that now, just as part of baseline. And if it can, what the implications of that change look like. Sometimes it's, using different types of technical tools. We've been working with a school that had a lot of customization around checks, both for check reconciliation and for positive pay out to their bank. And it ends up that all the customizations they had are no longer necessary and can be replaced by subroutine hooks on their banks. So, part of that is technically moving them to those subroutines, prototyping it, testing that out, and ensuring that they would get the same or better results using that setup than they would with their customization. And so typically we're going through a similar process for every decustomization. That may necessitate data cleanup or, just data cleanup because of SQL. And then again, reporting strategy and development. SQL opens a lot of doors in terms of reporting strategies, a lot of opportunities. And, sometimes you're in a place where you're ready for that. Sometimes you have a good setup, and we're just ensuring that that migration doesn't mess up any of that or enhances it in some way. Next. Infrastructure management. So as part of standing up that new environment, we would work with your infrastructure team in terms of specifications for procurement of new equipment and software as necessary. And then there's a lot of back and forth between our teams in terms of how to manage things in this new environment, how to manage the migration, managing custom code going forward, managing computed columns. Computed columns are just a completely different animal in SQL than they were in Unidata. And so it's just about learning a new process for managing them and promoting them and ensuring that they do what they're supposed to do within the SQL environment. And meanwhile, keeping the current systems running. On a lot of these projects, if a client isn't already using our core services, we will often include those services as part of the optimization process, so that the client team can be freed up to focus on the SQL environment and the changes that are coming while we keep current systems afloat. We've talked about this a couple of times, but we're really looking at all the different places where custom code may be used, and in particular, eliminating custom code against delivered software. So we frequently run into situations where a particular screen has been customized, a delivered screen has been customized to add some fields or to do something differently than it would normally do. These are the ones we're really targeting, most especially because these are the ones that hang you up in software updates. Sometimes the quote unquote bolt-ons aren't as critical to that cleanup. But often what we see is bolt-ons were created a long time ago before some new functionality was rolled out. Integrations. A lot of times integrations have been built through custom batch processes in Colleague, or they're using kind of a reporting tool to export data that's then scripted to be exported to another system, and all those kind of setups. What we're seeing more of are the opportunities to use APIs, to use ethos. Those kind of opportunities are arising now. And where that functionality exists, we want to try and get you there. It's more sustainable, it's less maintenance, and there's more forward, opportunities in those kind of setups. And yes. So again, reduction or elimination of delivered code means you're dealing with that less when you're doing software updates. You're not having to get that custom impact report that you have to work through before you can get a software update in. Less time to update, more transparency. It's more obvious how the system's working because you're not messing around with a lot of custom. And a focus on how you could actually use the delivered product the way it's intended. And as those updates come, to be able to adopt them. Next. Data cleanup. We run the data scanners that are delivered by Ellucian and use that as our first round of cleanup. We occasionally run into issues where the keys themselves have been messed up. Obviously, that becomes a more difficult kind of transition and cleanup to do. Typically requires programming support. Additionally, we do look at contextual data cleanup. And so these are situations where a setup may have been wrong 10 years ago and a whole bunch of student program records are messy, or phone numbers used to be attached to addresses and now they're attached to people, but a whole bunch of them are still lingering on addresses. And you want things to be more consistent for reporting purposes, for whatever you're doing. And we'll do those kind of cleanups primarily based out of those business process reviews, where we'll identify that, hey, we're running the reports and half the people don't have phone numbers. We can't figure out why. And we'll do those kind of cleanups as well. Some cleanups can be done through utilities. Sometimes we'll write a custom utility if that's what's necessary, depends on the volume of data. Some are just easier to do manually. Frequently we'll run into, a smattering of records where the dates are bad. And it's a lot simpler for the relevant staff to go in and just update those dates than it is to kind of do a programming effort. Throughout that process, we're keeping users in the loop. Typically, our first round of cleanup is in production. And so, it feels unsafe, it feels risky, and we want people to know that, as we're making updates that are necessary for the long-term, process, what got updated, when it got updated, what it could impact, and if there are issues that those can come back and be resolved. The other piece, though, is finding the source. A lot of times, data issues come up through integrations, and we want to ensure that once we've cleaned it up, it's clean, and it's not going to keep replicating. And so occasionally we'll have to fix something farther out to fix the data. And that's just part of the process. As I mentioned, phone numbers are a frequent one. User fields are also frequent. In the Unidata universe, we all got really comfortable with doing all kinds of crazy stuff with user fields. SQL, not so friendly to that. And so we're typically trying to find a better place to put that data. Sometimes that's just really old data that was used for one purpose, and we can move on from it, and we're just kind of cleaning it out. Occasionally, we will end up with a data transformation issue where an improvement to the process requires a configuration change that would impact your historical data. And we just want to make sure that it all aligns so that when you do a report for 5 years ago, you'd get similar results to one you're running now. And then finding homes for custom data if it's necessary to maintain it. Reporting strategy, again, looking at the opportunities that exist within SQL and what challenges exist now. Are there opportunities to change data sources? A lot of clients that are on ODS may see the opportunity to use SQL tables with views, to build a data warehouse, any of those kind of opportunities. The tools, there are many more tools, and some of them, particularly if you're in a Microsoft environment, are available to you at a fairly low cost. Part of those decisions are who develops reports now? How do you foresee that happening in the future? Is it IT mostly creates reports, or is it users create reports? What kind of training is necessary? And for any kind of migration of reporting, what are the critical reports to have on day one of that new environment? Testing the new model. So this is getting towards, really getting to the new world. As part of the business process reviews, technical changes, all these things that have happened so far, we develop test scripts. We work with the functional areas to develop test scripts and with IT. Those include new business processes, using the technical updates that have been made, cleaned up data, and identify dates and timeframes, as well as actual scripts for testing out all the processes in the new environment. That one validates the new model. It also validates that the migration of the data and custom code may work. And that you can do, when you go live, all the things that you would expect to be able to do. We can print checks, we can issue purchase orders, we can send a transcript, all of those kinds of things. In the next slide. And once you've gone through a couple of rounds of that kind of testing, which is pretty robust, you start planning for live and going live. Typically towards the end of the project, we start to put together a much more granular go live plan, which will include step-by-step instructions essentially. So if anybody on the team got hit by the bus, the other person knows what to run and when to run it and in what sequence it gets run. That plan gets communicated frequently and widely, but particularly with the team that's working on the go live, a lot of over communicating about what that plan is going to look like. A go live of these migrations is a substantial effort. It typically takes several days. And so ensuring that people know when they're on deck and what they need to do when they're on deck is really important. For the wider community, that will include an understanding of system downtime, communicating that system downtime, knowing what that general sequence of events is, and then once everything is done, signing off and celebrating, which, yay. This project from beginning to end is typically a 12 to 18 month effort. And so when you've put in that much time and all the work that goes into all these different steps, that last piece is really important. It's an achievement, but it's also the first step in sort of the new model. And getting used to, okay, we can now do things slightly differently and have better results as part of that. So on the other side, you have an infrastructure upgrade. You should come out of this with documented operating procedures that become live documents that continue to get updated. When somebody can't figure out how DReg works, you have a place to go and find out how we said DReg was going to work. Those were tested processes, and you know they work in that environment because you've already tested them. You should see significant customization reductions and overhead as a result of that. Typically, when that's part of the goal of the optimization, we see reductions somewhere in the 75 to 80% range of actual custom code, and potentially 80 to 90% of computed columns. For clients who've been on for a long time, the computed column numbers are really high because of the way we all used to do reporting in Unidata. Reporting improvements: one, better data; two, potentially a better platform to do that reporting from. And as a result of all the business process review and the testing, a staff focus on continuous improvement. That's how you move the ball forward, is let's look at this process. We want to do something new. How can we fit it within that framework and continue to do that process going forward? Questions?
No questions are in the chat just yet. So if anybody wants to come off of mute and ask a question or still type it in, we can do that now. And just as a reminder, we are going to be sending out the recording of the session for future use. Oh, Molly just asked, will we get the PowerPoint slides? Can be good as talking points to convince leadership we need an assessment. So yes, you will get the recording with the PowerPoint.
And as just in case some folks on the phone haven't worked with us before, we are very open with our opinions. So feel free to reach out and schedule a call. And you know, those discovery calls are always complimentary, so we can share our very loud opinions in a rambunctious way at any point.
Okay, we do have another question, Kelly and Mark. What tools do you have to look for data issues?
We, as Mark mentioned, we start first with the Ellucian delivered data scanners, and those pick up things like, you know, characters and fields where characters shouldn't be, data in date fields, for example, that isn't formatted as a date. Then we've also made some proprietary scanners that we also install in the environments that we work on. Just take a second stab at running through that data and finding any other errors that we found common that doesn't get picked up by the first round of data scanners. So we take a couple passes at it. And then, as Mark mentioned too, we have utilities developed that can update some of that data, or manual updates sometimes, depending on what the case is for that specific data set.
Okay. Another question, can you explain how this will enhance the student experience? They are just finishing the full self-service rollout.
Mark, wasn't sure if you wanted to take a stab at that one.
Sure. So a couple of things. One is self-service is a huge improvement, as you're probably well aware. But one thing, whether it's from the assessment side or the optimization side, taking, you know, you may have done this as part of your self-service rollout, taking sort of a life cycle view of your enrollment process from admission through registration to graduation, can really, and including students in that assessment, can really make a difference in terms of like just language things, things that we take for granted occasionally, but also potentially some configuration things that are involved in that. Typically, as we're doing student planning implementations in particular, we find a lot of things around the way curriculum setups have been established, the way some of the registration controls are configured, the way the degree audit setups may have been set up, that make that more or less user-friendly as a process. So sometimes we, some of our assessments really do focus down to that level in terms of what we're doing, but for an overall, it's really what's this process look like from beginning to end for a student, and is it as seamless as it should be? I think the other piece, which is more of an infrastructure issue, is that self-service has really been designed for SQL. And so performance in the self-service environment is better on a SQL platform.
Another one from Ernest. What is your opinion with moving to the cloud? Would you migrate on-prem and then move to the cloud as part of a longer-term strategy?
It's a complicated question, Ernest. We've seen both. We have actually, as of last night, we've moved 19 clients from on-prem to their own private cloud environment. So that's a very popular option right now, to move to sort of a self-hosted cloud, either on Amazon or Amazon Web Services, which is a great move for any infrastructure. We actually did a webinar last week on migrating to the cloud and modernizing your server room by getting rid of your server room. It's a great place to embed this project. The only thing that you want to be really clear with your constituents and your stakeholders on is, testing. You want to make sure that they don't lose faith in the cloud just because maybe there was a SQL data issue that was holding them back before. So it's just really important to keep all those swim lines open, keep the communication going, just to make sure, as we've all worked with functional end users before, it's really easy for people to lose faith in the system. So you just want to make sure that everybody's clear on where any bottlenecks are and test things appropriately. Did you also move them off of Solaris operating system? Yes.
Great questions. Any other questions from the group? And I will just note that we do put all of our recordings on our website in the What's Happening tab. So Ernest, in your case, if you wanted to take a look at that cloud webinar from last week, that's where they're all stored, and that's where this one will be stored. But you will get the direct email for this recording as well. Well, if there are no more questions, we appreciate everybody's time. We thank you as a part of this webinar series that we've been hosting. Like I said, always want to provide topical information. So if there's a topic that you think we should present on that's important to you, please submit it to us, info@forelli.com. And as I mentioned, on the What's Happening page is where our past recordings will live, so you can access them there as well. And if you have any additional questions after today's webinar, feel free to reach out to us at either our 888-864-3282 main phone line, or if you're working with an account manager already, you can reach out to one of them. So thank you again, and hope everybody has a great day.